So in accordance with my policy of trying to tell you up front what do you see in the real world, what do you not see in the real world, I will tell you, generally speaking, we're going to talk about net present value, internal rate of return, payback. The metric that you will most often hear in the real world is return on investment, or internal rate of return. Net present value is favored by finance academics because it gives you a dollar value figure, but CFOs tend to use return on investment, IRR, as a measure of the profitability or the rate of return on a particular project. So that is very real world. Lou talks about, under the not-for-profit discussion, he talks about the social value and social NPV model. I've never seen that used anywhere, so I suspect you can safely ignore that. However, he does also talk about project scoring, and that is a very common method where essentially healthcare organizations assign different weights to different criteria, and they weight capital projects using a scoring approach. I've used that myself. I've seen it done a lot. So generally speaking, I'd say 90% of this chapter is pretty relevant and pretty real-world based. So I'll have to do now. So when we talk about capital budgeting, what is it? Well, it's basically we're talking about the addition of fixed assets, buildings and equipment. That's generally what we talk about. They are important decisions because they typically are long-term in nature. When you build a new building, you're really looking at 30, 40, 50 years of potential economic life. They usually involve large expenditures. I mean, what was Duke's new cancer center? $260, $280 million. That's a lot of money. And they often define the strategic direction of the organization. So the fact that Duke spent a whole pile of cash on cancer tells the community that it serves that cancer care is important to Duke Health System. They're classified for different kinds of purposes. Can anyone think of a mandatory replacement? Like, can anyone think of a capital project that would be required, that the organization would have no choice? Pardon?
Like the EHR system?
If it's mandated by legislation, yeah. What's something even more primitive?
Sprinkler system.
Yeah. The roof falls in. The sprinkler system explodes. There could be OSHA could come in and say the EPA could come in and say you've got to spend some money on how you get rid of waste. There could be pollution and so on. So there are some kinds of capital projects that there's no choice. They're mandatory. They have to do them or else they go out of business. Expansion of an existing service, expansion into new services. So essentially, healthcare organizations will use these kinds of broad categories to prioritize different types of capital projects. First, anything that goes into the first category, mandatory replacement, there is no choice. You've got to find the money to do it or die. So for investor-owned businesses, essentially they want projects that contribute to shareholder value. The shareholders own the organization. They want management to choose projects that will increase the value of their shares and their wealth. Not-for-profit, however, they want their profit or their wealth is not as concerned, but they do want to make sure that they choose projects that overall have more positive NPV projects than negative NPV projects. So profit and wealth is not the driving concern, but on the other hand, you've got to make sure that you've got enough projects with NPV to outweigh the ones that do have negative NPVs. What is the consequences of having too little capital? Suppose you don't have enough buildings and equipment. What are the consequences of that?
Capacity issues.
Yeah, so what are the
Like
consequences?
not being able to fulfill services that are demanded.
Right, so if you haven't got enough buildings and equipment, to meet the demand for health care in your community, you're going to be turning patients away, or you're going to be forcing them to go elsewhere, or they won't be getting the kinds of care that they probably deserve. So not having too little capital is an access and perhaps a market share problem. What is the problem of having too much capital?
Could be underutilized and wasting space,
And that results in,
wasting money.
yeah, a lot higher costs than necessary. You got half-empty buildings and underutilized equipment. You've got a lot of money tied up in that capital. It's not being fully utilized. It's too expensive. So having the right amount of capital is not an easy thing, and that's why we're going to spend two sessions on it. But it has extremely important consequences, because too little capital, too much capital can really be a sentinel event in the organization's life. It could lead to bankruptcy, or it can lead to, on either extreme, because either too high costs or declining market share on the other hand. So what are we going to do in capital budgeting analysis? Well, essentially we're going to do a lot of what we did last term, which is going to identify the capital outlay, identify the operating flows, a terminal flow, and then assess the project's riskiness and discount those cash flows to measure the financial impact. So there's several key concepts that we have to talk about before we dive into this. Identifying the relevant cash flows. So that means the IC&C stands for incremental. So what we want to do in capital budgeting analysis is identify the incremental cash flows from a project. So what are the cash flows of UNC Health System with this project minus the UNC cash flows without this project? The difference between those two numbers is the effect of the project. That sounds simple, but as we'll see when you do your case in 2 weeks, it's not always that simple to identify the effects that are going to happen as a consequence of a particular project. Second, cash flow versus accounting income. What does that mean? I claim finance people are concerned with cash flow. Accountants are concerned with accounting income. Why?
Well, in healthcare, your accounts receivable could be huge, whereas, you might not have that cash, versus, it's just the idea that what appears on your balance sheet isn't necessarily what indicates what cash you have.
Right, so a good example would be depreciation. Depreciation is an accounting fiction. It's a way of saying it's a non-cash expense. And it's from an accounting perspective, it's appropriate to look at it as a cost of doing business, but it's a non-cash expense. Therefore, finance people are not interested in depreciation. They are only interested in one thing. When does the cash go in or out of your bank account? When does it really go in? When does it really go out? Cash flow time, which is cash flow timing, which is the next issue as well. Project life. Many capital projects involve assets that have got 20, 30, 40, 50 years of life. There's no analyst I know who likes to do 50-year cash flow projections. So typically what we'll see in a building, for example, we'll see 10 years or 20 years of cash flow projections, and then they assume that in the 20th year, the building is sold for its current market value plus 1% inflation per year, something like that. It just comes up with an arbitrary terminal value to account for the fact that there is an asset 20 years from now, but we have very little confidence in cash flows that are that far out. So that's one way of dealing with project life. What's a sunk cost? Josh.
You've already paid for it, and so don't really take into your decision because it's already happened.
Exactly.
Paying for a building, it's already done, you've already paid for the year, so don't worry.
What was the example you used?
Like, let's say you paid for a building, and you're deciding if you want to use that building for a service, you shouldn't take that into account, the building costs of whether they provide the service, because it's already
Right. So finance is always looking forward, always looking forward. Future cash flows are the only thing that matters in finance. An expense that was incurred 6 months ago or a week ago is irrelevant to deciding whether you should continue with the project or not. Probably one of the worst examples of this I saw was, I remember reading about a nuclear power facility 25 years ago. And they spent all this money, and some politician said, but we've already spent $5 billion on this. We have to finish it. Well, the future cash flows from that power facility were negative. But the argument the politician was making was we'd already spent $4.5 billion. We can't walk away from it. And that is a fallacious argument, because if the future cash flows for the power facility were negative, they should have walked away from it. So some costs are irrelevant in financial decision. Opportunity costs. What does that mean? How are opportunity costs relevant to a capital budgeting decision? Sarah.
Well, building on Josh's example, so if you purchased a building and now you're trying to decide between which two service lines to put in that building, you would consider the cost or the income you would have had if you had put in another service as opposed to a service you're considering.
Exactly. So by using land, for example, for one particular use, that essentially prevents you from using it for another particular use. So the opportunity cost is what cash flows would the land have generated if you had used it for another purpose. So opportunity costs are important. Effect on the business's other projects. What does that mean?
Got to make sure that there's no cannibalization going on. This isn't just going to eat up the funds.
Okay, Brian, what does cannibalization mean?
Well, it could be, I'm trying to think of an example, but basically that this new service will eat up, if these other funds were going to be allocated to surgery, but now they need to be allocated towards this new building.
Okay, so that's it. I will give you a very specific example. At one point, when I was a manager, the head of housekeeping came to me and said, we want to install automated bedpan washers on the nursing units. See, management is really glamorous at times. So we had they came to me with a proposal, and so I said we would try it out on a few nursing units. So we put these automated bedpan washers. So what that would be is, instead of the housekeeping going around collecting all the bedpans, taking it down to sterile supply, having them wash and sterilize them, and then take them back up on carts back to the units, there's this little machine right on the nursing unit where the nurse would just stick it on a conveyor belt. It would go through the thing, it would zap it, and then you have a nice clean bedpan. So we tried it on 3 units. Fortunately, one of the smart things I did do on this particular situation was I just tried it out in a few units versus going to the whole hospital. And within about a month, I had the director of nursing in my office. She said, well, that's great for housekeeping. They've reduced their costs. They don't have housekeeping people running all over the hospital anymore. But guess what my nurses are now doing? They are now in the position of having to take the thing down to this thing, wait while it goes through the machine, get it when it comes out and comes back. So my overtime is going up. The nurses are spending more time running around delivering bedpans. So I failed to consider the effect that, okay, yes, we're reducing housekeeping costs, but it's increasing nursing costs over here. So that's an example of an unanticipated consequence of a capital budgeting decision. Shipping and installation costs, what does that mean? How is that relevant to capital budgeting problem?
It's initial cash flow that has to be spent at the beginning of the project.
Right, so if you want a new CT scanner and you've got to rip down a few walls to make it operational, then that is a cost that would be incurred because of the CT scanner. It would not be incurred otherwise. So again, shipping and installation costs are a very relevant capital budgeting cost. Changes in net working capital. What does that mean? What is net working capital? Anybody remember from last year? 740? Sarah?
I think net working capital was where it's talking about basically the increase in your liabilities compared to the increase in your assets and how that works
Well, you got the definition correct. We're halfway there. Working capital, net working capital is the difference between current assets and current liabilities. So suppose an organization builds a new patient tower that doubles the number of patients. What will happen to all patient accounts receivable? It will go up, probably double. What will happen to liabilities? If your business doubles in size, isn't it likely it will double as well? So the change between the current assets and the current liabilities as a result of this project is a cost that has to be financed, and it's a part of the capital budgeting process. Inflation effects. What is inflation? Just define it. Pretend I'm your grandmother. How would you explain it to me? And except for gender, that's not a stretch of the imagination. Wow.
It costs more, or it costs more money to buy something before.
Right, so it's the change in the consumer price index is the typical measure of inflation. There's producer price indexes, there are various sectors, but eventually is what does a particular piece of good or service cost today compared to 1 year from today? And the change in that price is the rate of inflation. So inflation has to be built into capital budgeting analysis. Why do I say that?
How would you build growth rates into the projections? Similar, like a growth rate.
Okay, so let's take a look at a capital budgeting analysis. We've got revenues and we've got costs. What do you think will be happening to those lines in the capital budget over time? Well, there'll be inflation, but how will it differ from line to line to line to line? In other words, how might inflation rates differ within a capital budgeting decision? Right, so give me an example of a revenue item. Let's look at Medicare. What kind of rate do you think Medicare is going to increase at? What do you think the inflation rate in Medicare is going to be over the next year or two? Okay, and under the Affordable Care Act, it's actually negative. So what is the rate inflation going to be in nurses' salaries over the next 1 or 2 years? As primary care expands, sorry? It could be higher than the rate of inflation. My point is that every single line in a capital budgeting analysis will have a different rate of inflation. Medicare is going to be negative for the next 1 or 2 years. Private payers, I don't know, 1-2% per year. Nurses' salaries are probably going to go up. Pharmaceuticals, generally over the last 20 years, have had higher than average rates of inflation. Minimum wage workers, the people who clean the floors of a hospital, people who work in the dietary department, probably flat. So it's really important in a capital budgeting analysis to recognize that all the different components that go into the consequences of a project may have different inflation rates. Cash flow estimation bias. What does that mean? So you as managers will come up, you will have different capital projects, you'll go to your staff and you'll ask for revenue and cost forecasts. Why might they be biased?
The project's succeed, so they might inflate it down the road, which is similar to be very successful.
So what might they inflate and what might they discount?
Revenues for sure.
All right. So if I'm a physician and I really want this new CT scanner, and my income is going to be increased by having the CT scanner, I may be unconsciously or consciously prone to inflating or the revenue estimates and underestimating the cost estimates. And that is something all of you as managers, I guarantee 100% will see. People are very committed to their capital projects. They want to see them funded by management. They will take an optimistic eye to their cash flow estimates. So you have to have your skeptic's hat on every time you get a capital project that's got cash flow estimates with it. And then finally, strategic value. What does that mean? Why might a capital project have strategic value? Or how does the strategic value of a project play into a capital budgeting decision?
Well, like if Duke is trying to be a competitor in cancer care, and that's some strategic overall mission of their organization long term, to be number one in cancer care compared to other competitors.
Right, so Duke has made a decision to get into cancer care. They may even be willing to accept negative profitability projects for a while just to get into the market and establish a reputation. And the classic example, I think, is Hopkins, or I can't remember which large health system it was in the Northeast, that made a strategic decision to go into Eastern Europe and start establishing radiology consulting services with hospitals in Eastern Europe. They knew they were going to lose money on it, but they saw it as a foothold in the market. It's a way to break into the market. So let's go through a simple